Would you report your own sister to the police if you discovered she'd been poisoning your child for 2 years, even if it meant losing your entire family forever? My son's doctor found something I couldn't believe. When I took my 8-year-old boy Daniel to what I thought would be a routine checkup at our pediatrician's office in Sacramento, California, I never imagined that a simple appointment would unravel a web of deceit that had been destroying my child from the inside out for over 2 years. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because what I discovered that day would tear my family apart in ways I'm still trying to understand. I grew up in a small town outside Sacramento where everyone knew everyone's business and family loyalty was everything. My sister Rachel and I were close growing up, only 2 years apart, and we shared everything from clothes to secrets to dreams about the families we'd have someday. We were inseparable as children, spending summers riding bikes through the neighborhood and winters huddled together watching movies. Our mother used to say we were two halves of the same soul, and I believed her. When I married Tom and had Daniel, and Rachel married Kevin and had twin girls just a year later, it felt like our childhood dreams were coming true. Our kids would grow up together like we did, and our families would be intertwined forever. I remember the day Rachel told me she was pregnant with twins. We both cried happy tears and talked about how our children would be best friends, how we'd take family vacations together, and how we'd grow old watching our grandchildren play together someday. Daniel was always a sensitive child, the kind of boy who cried easily and felt things deeply. He was born 3 weeks early, a tiny bundle who fit in the crook of my arm, and from his first moments, he seemed to feel everything more intensely than other babies. He startled at loud noises, cried when the lights were too bright, and needed constant soothing. The pediatrician assured me that some babies were just more sensitive, and that Daniel would likely grow into a thoughtful, empathetic person. When he was 6, he started having these episodes where he'd complain his stomach hurt, and sometimes he'd throw up for no apparent reason. The first time it happened, it was a Tuesday morning before school. He came into our bedroom at 5 in the morning, clutching his stomach and saying it hurt really bad. Within minutes, he was vomiting into the toilet, and I held his hair back and rubbed his back, thinking it was just a stomach bug that would pass in a day or two. At first, I thought it was just a stomach bug going around, but the episodes kept happening every few weeks. I took him to our pediatrician, Dr. Morrison, who ran some basic tests and said it was probably just a sensitive stomach. He suggested we keep a food diary and try eliminating certain foods to see if that helped. Dr. Morrison had been Daniel's doctor since birth, and I trusted him completely. He'd guided us through colic, ear infections, and all the normal childhood illnesses with patience and expertise. The food diary didn't reveal much. I recorded everything Daniel ate for 3 months straight, noting portion sizes, ingredients, and any symptoms that followed. I eliminated dairy for a month, then gluten, then common allergens like eggs and nuts. Nothing made a difference. Daniel would be fine for weeks, then suddenly he'd wake up in the middle of the night with severe stomach pain and nausea. The randomness of it was maddening because I couldn't find any pattern or trigger. Tom and I started to wonder if it was anxiety-related because the episodes seemed random. Daniel had always been a worrier, the kind of kid who needed extra reassurance before the first day of school or a doctor's appointment. We tried everything we could think of. We made sure he got enough sleep, limited his screen time to an hour a day, and even took him to a child therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders. The therapist, Dr. Brooks, was a kind woman who had a playroom filled with toys where kids could express themselves through play. The therapist said Daniel showed some signs of generalized anxiety, but nothing severe enough to cause such intense physical symptoms. She taught him breathing exercises and gave us strategies for managing his worries, but the stomach episodes continued. Dr. Brooks suggested that sometimes children somaticize stress, meaning they express emotional distress through physical symptoms. But she also said that the severity and frequency of Daniel's episodes suggested we should continue looking for a physical cause. As the months went by, I noticed other changes in Daniel. He became quieter and more withdrawn, like a light inside him was slowly dimming. He used to love going to his cousin's house to play with Rachel's twins, Emma and Lily. They'd spend hours building forts, playing dress-up, and putting on elaborate shows for the adults. But he started making excuses not to go. When I asked him why, he'd just shrug and say he didn't feel like it, or that he wanted to stay home and read instead. I figured maybe he was just growing out of the phase where playing with girls was fun, even though they were his favorite cousins. Boys at that age sometimes start to feel self-conscious about playing with girls, especially when they start school and peer pressure kicks in. I didn't push it because I wanted him to make his own choices about how he spent his time. Looking back, I wish I'd asked more questions, dug deeper into why he suddenly didn't want to spend time with his cousins. The stomach episodes continued through his 7th year, sometimes happening twice a month, sometimes skipping a month entirely. I kept detailed records of everything he ate, everywhere he went, and everyone he spent time with, trying to find a pattern. I had 3 spiral notebooks filled with entries, color-coded by severity of symptoms. I noted the weather, what he'd done that day, whether he'd been stressed about anything, and what he'd eaten for every meal. Nothing made sense. There was no consistent pattern I could identify. Dr. Morrison suggested we see a pediatric gastroenterologist, so we made an appointment with Dr. Helen Chen at UC Davis Medical Center. She was thorough and kind, spending over an hour with us during our first appointment. She asked detailed questions about Daniel's symptoms, his diet, his stress levels, and our family medical history. She ran tests for celiac disease, lactose intolerance, food allergies, and even rare conditions like gastroparesis and cyclic vomiting syndrome. Everything came back normal. Dr. Chen suggested that sometimes children develop functional abdominal pain where there's no physical cause, but the pain is very real. It's a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning they rule out everything else first. She recommended we continue with therapy and perhaps try some relaxation techniques. She also suggested biofeedback therapy, where Daniel could learn to control his body's stress responses. We did everything she suggested with dedication and hope. I taught Daniel breathing exercises that we practiced every morning before school. We'd sit together on the couch, and I'd guide him through deep belly breaths, counting slowly to help him focus. We practiced mindfulness together, using apps designed for children that taught meditation through games and stories. I even started doing yoga with him in the mornings before school, following videos that were specifically designed for kids. We'd roll out our mats in the living room and do poses with names like Downward Dog and Warrior, and Daniel seemed to enjoy the routine. Some weeks seemed better than others, but the episodes never completely stopped. We'd have a good month where I'd start to think maybe we'd turned a corner, and then bam, another severe episode would hit out of nowhere. The unpredictability was exhausting. I started to feel like I was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, unable to relax because I never knew when the next episode would strike. What really started to worry me was how Daniel's personality changed. My bright, curious boy who used to ask endless questions about everything became quiet and seemed to carry a heaviness that no 8-year-old should have. He stopped asking me why the sky was blue or how birds knew where to fly in winter. He'd sit at the dinner table pushing food around his plate, lost in thought, and when I'd ask what he was thinking about, he'd just say nothing. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, called me one day to say that Daniel seemed distracted in class and his grades were slipping. She said he'd always been one of her best students, eager to participate and quick to understand new concepts. But lately, he'd been staring out the window during lessons, forgetting to turn in homework and seeming disconnected from his classmates. She asked if everything was okay at home, and I had to explain about his ongoing health issues. Daniel had always been a strong student, bringing home A's and B's without much effort. He loved reading and would often finish chapter books, meant for kids 2 grades ahead of him. But suddenly his report card showed C's and even a D in math, his previously strongest subject. When I asked him about it, he said he was trying his best, and the look of defeat on his face broke my heart. My 7-year-old shouldn't have looked so defeated. Tom and I had many late-night conversations about what could be wrong with our son. We'd lie in bed after Daniel was asleep, talking in hushed voices about every possibility. We wondered if we were somehow failing him as parents, if there was something in our home environment causing him stress. Tom worked long hours as an engineer, and I worked part-time as a nurse, and we worried that maybe Daniel needed more of our time and attention. We examined every aspect of our lives, from our work schedules to our marriage to our parenting styles. We asked ourselves hard questions. Were we fighting too much in front of him? Was he picking up on stress we didn't realize we were expressing? Did he feel neglected because we were so focused on finding a medical solution that we weren't just being present with him? We couldn't find anything that would explain why our previously happy child was suffering so much. Rachel noticed the changes too. She'd call me multiple times a week asking how Daniel was doing and whether the doctors had figured anything out yet. She seemed genuinely concerned, always offering to help in any way she could. She'd say things like, "Let me take him for the afternoon so you can rest," or "I'll watch him while you and Tom have a date night." She'd volunteer to watch Daniel if we needed to run errands, and she'd bring over homemade soup when he was having a bad episode. Looking back now, her concern takes on a completely different meaning, but at the time I was just grateful to have a supportive sister. I thought she was being a caring aunt who was worried about her nephew. I'd thank her profusely for her help and tell her how much it meant to me to have family support during such a difficult time. I had no idea that her offers to help were actually opportunities for her to continue poisoning my child. The summer before Daniel turned 8, we took a family vacation to Lake Tahoe. We rented a cabin right on the water, a charming place with a stone fireplace and a deck overlooking the lake. We invited Rachel's family to join us for a week, imagining lazy days swimming and hiking, evenings around the campfire roasting marshmallows, and family bonding time away from the stress of doctor's appointments and medical tests. I hoped that getting away from home and spending time in nature would help Daniel relax and maybe give us some clue about what was triggering his stomach problems. The first few days were wonderful. Daniel seemed more like his old self, laughing and playing in the lake with his cousins. He built sandcastles with Emma and Lily, went kayaking with Tom, and stayed up late catching fireflies in mason jars. I remember thinking that maybe the fresh air and change of scenery was exactly what he needed. But on the 4th day, he had one of his worst episodes yet. It was early morning, and I heard him crying in the bathroom. When I got there, he was in so much pain that he was doubled over, crying and begging for it to stop. His face was pale and sweaty, and he was shaking. It scared me more than any previous episode because this one seemed more severe. He kept saying it hurt so bad, "Mama, make it stop," and I felt utterly helpless. We packed up and drove home early, cutting the vacation short. The 4-hour drive home was miserable, with Daniel lying in the back seat with a bucket, moaning in pain. Tom drove as fast as he safely could while I sat in the back holding Daniel's hand and trying to keep him comfortable. Rachel seemed upset about leaving early, saying she'd been looking forward to this vacation for months, and couldn't we just take Daniel to an urgent care in Tahoe instead? Kevin, her husband, seemed annoyed, which I thought was a bit insensitive, given that my child was clearly suffering. He made comments about how we'd wasted money on the cabin rental, and how Emma and Lily were disappointed to leave early. But I didn't say anything because I didn't want to cause family drama. Family harmony was important to all of us, and I'd been raised to believe that keeping the peace was worth swallowing your frustrations sometimes. My mother had always taught us that family comes first, and that we shouldn't air our grievances publicly. Back home, the episodes continued with the same unpredictable pattern. I started to notice something strange. though I didn't put the pieces together at the time. Daniel's worst episodes seemed to happen after he'd spent time at Rachel's house. I mentioned this observation to Tom one evening while we were doing dishes. He thought about it and pointed out that Daniel spent a lot of time at Rachel's house, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, so it was probably just coincidence. That made sense to me at the time, and I dismissed my concerns. Daniel loved spending time with his cousins, and Rachel was always so willing to have him over. She'd text me saying she was making cookies and did Daniel want to come help, or that she was taking the twins to the park and Daniel was welcome to join. It seemed like normal aunt and nephew activities, and I was grateful for the help since I was juggling work and constant medical appointments. As Daniel's 8th birthday approached, I decided to throw him a big party. He'd been through so much with all the doctor appointments and stomach problems that I wanted to do something special to cheer him up. We invited his whole class, 23 kids, plus his cousins and family friends, to a party at a local trampoline park. I spent weeks planning it, ordering a custom cake decorated with his favorite superhero, and putting together goodie bags filled with toys and candy. Daniel seemed excited in the days leading up to the party, and I was hopeful that he was finally starting to feel better. He helped me address invitations and talked about which games we should play. He wanted a superhero theme, so I bought decorations and even hired someone to dress up as his favorite character. It felt good to see him excited about something again, after so many months of watching him struggle. The party itself was a success. Daniel laughed more that day than I'd seen him laugh in months. He bounced on the trampolines with his friends, attempted flips into the foam pit, and played dodgeball with enthusiasm. He ate 2 slices of pizza without any stomach problems, devoured a huge piece of birthday cake, and seemed genuinely happy. I took dozens of photos and videos, wanting to capture every moment of his joy. Rachel came with her twins and helped me organize games and hand out cake. She seemed like the perfect sister that day, jumping in to help without being asked, keeping the kids entertained, and making sure I could relax and enjoy watching Daniel have fun. She even brought an extra gift for Daniel, an expensive remote control car that he'd been wanting for months. It was one of those perfect family moments that you want to freeze in time forever. But 2 days after the party, Daniel had another severe episode. This time, it was different in a way that terrified me. Along with the stomach pain and vomiting, he seemed confused and disoriented. When I asked him questions like "What day is it?" or "What's your teacher's name?" he struggled to answer. His pupils looked strange to me, bigger than normal, and the black part seemed to take up almost his whole eye. He was sweating profusely, even though our house was cool, and his skin felt clammy to the touch. I called Dr. Morrison's emergency line, and the nurse told me to take Daniel to the emergency room immediately. She said the confusion and dilated pupils were concerning symptoms that needed to be evaluated right away. I woke Tom up. We bundled Daniel into the car and raced to the nearest hospital. Tom held Daniel in the back seat while I drove, running red lights and going 20 miles over the speed limit. I didn't care if I got pulled over. My child was in crisis. At the ER, they took us back immediately. The triage nurse saw Daniel's condition and called for a doctor right away. They ran a full battery of tests over the next several hours. Blood work to check for infections and metabolic problems, urine tests to check kidney function, a CT scan to rule out anything wrong with his brain or abdomen, and an EKG to check his heart. Every test they ran came back showing nothing seriously wrong, which should have been reassuring but instead felt frustrating. Everything came back normal except for some slightly elevated liver enzymes, which the ER doctor said could be caused by frequent vomiting. The liver processes many of the body's toxins, and when you vomit a lot, it can stress the liver and cause enzyme levels to rise temporarily. They gave Daniel the 4th fluids because he was dehydrated from all the vomiting and anti-nausea medication through the IV. After a few hours and a liter of fluids, he started to feel better and seemed more alert. They sent us home around 6 in the morning with instructions to follow up with our regular pediatrician within the next few days. The ER doctor said to bring Daniel back if his symptoms got worse or if he developed a fever. I carried Daniel to the car because he was too weak to walk, and he fell asleep almost immediately once we started driving. Tom and I drove home in silence, both of us exhausted and scared and no closer to understanding what was wrong with our child. I made an appointment with Dr. Morrison for the following week, the soonest he could see us. This time, I brought all my records, every single note I'd taken over the past 2 years about Daniel's episodes. I had 3 thick notebooks, printouts from Dr. Chen's tests, discharge papers from the ER visit, and a timeline I'd created showing every episode and what preceded it. I laid it all out for Dr. Morrison on his desk and told him that I felt like we were missing something important. He looked through everything carefully, taking his time to read through my notes and review the test results. I could see his expression change from polite concern to genuine puzzlement as he absorbed the full scope of what Daniel had been through. He asked me questions about family history, whether anyone in our family had autoimmune disorders or rare conditions, whether Daniel had been exposed to any chemicals or toxins that I knew of. Dr. Morrison said something that stayed with me. He said that when you hear hoofbeats, you should think horses, not zebras, meaning you should consider common explanations before rare ones. It's a saying they teach in medical school to prevent doctors from immediately jumping to rare diagnoses when common ones are more likely. But he also said that when horses don't make sense, when you've ruled out all the common causes and the patient is still sick, sometimes you do have to start looking for zebras. He decided to run some additional blood tests, including a comprehensive metabolic panel and tests for rare metabolic disorders that could cause Daniel's symptoms. He also ordered something called a toxicology screen, which tests for various substances in the bloodstream, including medications, drugs, and certain poisons. At the time, I thought that last test was strange. Daniel wasn't taking any medications, and he certainly wasn't exposed to drugs or poisons. But Dr. Morrison said it was better to be thorough. While we waited for those results, which would take about a week to come back from the lab, Daniel seemed to improve. He went almost 3 weeks without an episode, which was the longest stretch in over a year. I started to feel cautiously optimistic that maybe whatever was wrong was resolving on its own. Kids go through phases, I told myself. Maybe his body was just adjusting to something developmental, and he was growing out of whatever this was. During those 3 good weeks, Daniel seemed more like himself. His energy returned, and he started engaging with his schoolwork again. Mrs. Patterson sent home a note saying she'd noticed improvement in his focus and participation. He even asked if we could have Emma and Lily over for a play date, which surprised me since he'd been avoiding his cousins for months. I said yes, happy that he wanted to reconnect with them. Then came the appointment that changed everything. Dr. Morrison called me on a Thursday afternoon, which was unusual because he normally had his nurse call with test results. I was at work, finishing up my shift at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, when my phone rang. His voice on the other end sounded serious, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach drop even before he said anything specific. He asked if I could bring Daniel in the next morning for a follow-up. He said there was something in the test results that he needed to discuss with me in person. I asked if everything was okay, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was racing. He said he'd rather discuss the results in person, which is doctor code for there's something wrong. I tried to press him for details, but he gently insisted that it would be better to talk face to face. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed next to Tom, staring at the ceiling and imagining every possible terrible diagnosis: cancer, leukemia, some rare genetic disorder, a degenerative disease. My nursing background made it worse, because I knew too many possibilities, too many ways a child could be seriously ill, Tom tried to reassure me, saying that doctors always want to discuss results in person, and it didn't necessarily mean bad news, but I knew better. Dr. Morrison had called with results before, and he'd never insisted on an in-person meeting like this. The next morning, I took Daniel to Dr. Morrison's office. I'd arranged for Tom to meet us there because I had a feeling I'd need support for whatever we were about to hear. The waiting room felt different somehow, like the air was heavier. When the nurse called us back, she smiled at Daniel in a way that seemed forced, and she gave me a look that confirmed my fears. Something was very wrong. Dr. Morrison met us in the exam room, and he had a folder in his hands that he held carefully, like it contained something fragile or dangerous. He asked Daniel if he'd mind sitting in the waiting room for a few minutes while he talked to me and Dad first. He gave Daniel his tablet loaded with games to keep him occupied. Once Daniel was out of the room, Dr. Morrison closed the door and sat down across from Tom and me. His words are burned into my memory forever, every syllable etched into my brain. He said that Daniel's blood work had come back with some very concerning findings. Specifically, there were trace amounts of a substance in Daniel's system that absolutely shouldn't be there. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him to explain it in simpler terms. He took a deep breath and explained that the toxicology screen had detected low levels of a prescription medication called lorazepam, which is a benzodiazepine sedative that's sometimes used to treat severe anxiety, panic disorders, and seizures. I told him there must be a mistake. Daniel wasn't taking any medications like that. We'd never even given him anything stronger than children's Tylenol or ibuprofen for fevers. There must have been a mix-up at the lab, I insisted. Maybe they'd confused Daniel's sample with someone else's. Doctor. Morrison shook his head and said they'd actually run the test twice to confirm the results because the finding was so unexpected. Both tests came back positive for lorazepam. Dr. Morrison said that's exactly why the results were so alarming. The medication wasn't prescribed to Daniel, which meant he was being exposed to it somehow without our knowledge. He explained that the levels weren't high enough to cause acute serious harm like an overdose, but they were consistent with repeated small doses over an extended period of time. The concentration in his bloodstream suggested he'd been exposed to this medication multiple times, possibly for months or even years. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. I asked how this could be possible. Where could Daniel be getting this medication? Who could be giving it to him? Dr. Morrison's expression was grave, heavy with the weight of what he had to tell us. He said there were only a few possibilities. Either Daniel was somehow accidentally ingesting someone else's medication on a regular basis, like finding pills and thinking they were candy, or, and he paused for a long moment before saying this, someone was giving it to him intentionally. The room started to spin. I felt Tom grab my hand and squeeze it hard. I couldn't process what he was saying. Who would give my child medication without my knowledge or permission? Why would anyone do that? What purpose would it serve? Dr. Morrison continued, and I forced myself to focus on his words even though I felt like I might pass out. He explained that the pattern of Daniel's symptoms, the episodic nature of them, the timing, all of it was consistent with intermittent exposure to this type of sedative. The stomach pain, he explained, was a known side effect of benzodiazepines, especially in children. The nausea and vomiting could be caused by the medication affecting the digestive system. The confusion and dilated pupils during the worst episodes were signs of a higher dose or built-up toxicity. Even the changes in Daniel's personality, the withdrawal and quietness, could be explained by chronic exposure to a sedative. Everything that had puzzled us for 2 years suddenly had an explanation, and that explanation was horrifying. I asked Dr. Morrison what we needed to do. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it was coming from far away. Tom was silent beside me, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. Dr. Morrison said that given the circumstances, he was legally obligated to report this to Child Protective Services. He explained that this fell under the category of potential child abuse or neglect, and as a mandated reporter, he had no choice but to notify the authorities. He assured me that this didn't mean Tom and I were under suspicion. He'd known us for 8 years and knew we were devoted parents. But an investigation needed to happen to determine how Daniel was being exposed to this medication and who was responsible. Someone with access to Daniel had been giving him this drug repeatedly, and that person needed to be identified and stopped. It was a matter of protecting Daniel and potentially other children if the perpetrator had access to other kids. Now, this is where I did something that I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. When Detective Palmer called me to say they'd found crushed pills in Rachel's kitchen and wanted to interview Daniel again with more specific questions, I made the decision to be present for that interview even though Rachel was my sister and I knew it might destroy our relationship forever. I told Detective Palmer everything I could remember about Daniel's episodes, including my observation that they seemed to happen after he'd been to Rachel's house. I gave her permission to question Daniel directly about what he ate and drank at his aunt's house. I chose my son's safety over my sister's privacy and my family's unity, and I knew there was no going back from that choice. Dr. Morrison asked me to think carefully about who had regular access to Daniel, who spent time alone with him, and whether I knew anyone who took this particular medication. Lorazepam was a commonly prescribed medication for anxiety and seizures, so it wasn't unusual for people to have it in their medicine cabinets. He needed me to think about Daniel's routine, where he went, who he saw, who might have the opportunity to give him medication without us knowing. That's when it hit me like a physical blow. Rachel. My sister Rachel took that exact medication. She'd been prescribed it years ago for anxiety and panic attacks, and she'd mentioned it in passing once when we were talking about mental health. She'd said it was the only thing that helped her feel calm when her anxiety got really bad. And Daniel spent time at her house regularly, sometimes multiple times a week. He was alone with her during those visits. But the thought that formed in my mind was so horrible, so completely unthinkable, that I pushed it away immediately. Not Rachel. Not my sister, my best friend, the person I'd trusted with my most precious treasure. There had to be another explanation. There had to be. Maybe Daniel had accidentally gotten into her medication bottle when he was at her house. Kids are curious, and medicine bottles don't always have child-proof caps that actually work. Maybe he'd found her pills and thought they were candy or vitamins. Dr. Morrison could see the wheels turning in my head. He asked me gently if I'd thought of someone. I told him about Rachel's medication, but I insisted there must be an innocent explanation. My voice was shaking as I tried to convince him and myself that it was just an accident. Daniel must have gotten into her pills accidentally. Rachel would never intentionally hurt him. She loved him. She was his aunt. Family doesn't hurt family, not like that. Dr. Morrison's expression told me he didn't think it was that simple, but he said we'd let the authorities investigate and determine what happened. He said not to confront anyone yet, not to tell anyone about the test results, because if someone was intentionally medicating Daniel, we didn't want to tip them off and give them a chance to cover their tracks or come up with a story. He said a social worker would be contacting us within 24 hours. Tom and I took Daniel home, and I felt like I was moving through a nightmare. Everything looked normal on the surface. Our house, our street, our neighborhood, everything was exactly the same as it had been that morning. But everything had changed. My child had been poisoned, and I had no idea how long it had been going on or who was responsible. Or maybe I did know, and I just couldn't accept it. The next few days were a blur of interviews and questions. A social worker from CPS named Linda Martinez came to our house the following day. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who'd clearly done this kind of investigation many times before. She interviewed Tom and me separately asking detailed questions about Daniel's routine, who he spent time with, who had access to him, and where he went regularly. She asked about our extended family, our friends, Daniel's teachers, anyone who might have regular contact with him. Then she talked to Daniel alone in his bedroom while Tom and I waited downstairs, trying not to imagine what questions she was asking him. The interview lasted almost an hour, and when they came back downstairs, Daniel looked confused and scared. Linda assured him that he wasn't in trouble and that she was just trying to help him stay healthy and safe. She told us she'd be in touch soon and that we should continue Daniel's normal routine as much as possible. They took all the medication bottles from our house to verify that we didn't have lorazepam or any other benzodiazepines. They photographed our medicine cabinet and made a list of every medication we had, from prescription antibiotics to over-the-counter pain relievers. They were thorough and professional, but it felt invasive and scary to have strangers examining every aspect of our private lives. Tom was devastated and angry. He wanted to immediately confront Rachel, to call her up and demand to know if she'd been medicating our son, but Linda Martinez had advised us not to do that yet. She said they needed to conduct their investigation properly, gather evidence, and interview potential suspects before anyone was confronted. If we tipped off whoever was responsible, they might destroy evidence, change their story, or even flee. It was torture to act normal when everything felt like it was falling apart. I had to take Daniel to Rachel's house that weekend for a family dinner at our parents' house. It was already scheduled weeks in advance for our dad's birthday, and canceling would have raised suspicions and questions I wasn't ready to answer. I sat there at my mother's dining table, watching Rachel interact with Daniel, looking for signs of something wrong, searching her face for guilt or deception. She seemed completely normal, affectionate with him, asking about his school and his friends, complimenting him on his recent good grades. Could this woman, who'd shared a room with me growing up, who'd been my maid of honor at my wedding, who I'd trusted completely with my child, really be poisoning him? I watched her cut him an extra-large slice of birthday cake and ruffle his hair affectionately. I watched her laugh at something he said and pull him into a hug. She seemed like the same sister I'd always known, and I wanted desperately to believe this was all a horrible mistake. Daniel seemed fine at the dinner, laughing at Kevin's jokes about work and playing board games with his cousins after we ate. But I noticed that he stayed close to me the whole evening, not wandering off to play in the other room with Emma and Lily like he usually did. When Rachel offered him a homemade chocolate chip cookie, his favorite, I watched like a hawk as he ate it, my heart pounding and my hands sweating. Nothing happened. He was fine. He ate the cookie and asked for another one, and Rachel gave it to him with a smile. The CPS investigation moved quickly once they started looking into it seriously with the evidence of Daniel's positive toxicology screen. They interviewed Rachel and Kevin separately and together, asking them detailed questions about their interactions with Daniel, how often he visited their house, what activities they did together, and whether they had any medications in their home. They asked permission to search Rachel's house, and she gave it immediately because, as she told me later in a phone call, she had nothing to hide and wanted to help figure out what was happening to Daniel. They found her prescription bottle for lorazepam in her medicine cabinet, exactly where you'd expect it to be, in a child-proof container on a high shelf. But then the detective assigned to the case, a woman named Detective Sarah Palmer, who specialized in crimes against children, noticed something interesting during her systematic search. She counted the pills in Rachel's bottle and compared the count to the prescription date and the dosage instructions printed on the label. The was filled 3 months earlier, and Rachel's prescribed dosage of 1 pill daily as needed. She should have had significantly more pills remaining. Even accounting for taking extra pills on particularly anxious days, there were at least 30 to 40 pills unaccounted for. When confronted with this discrepancy, Rachel said she sometimes took an extra pill when her anxiety was really bad, and sometimes she forgot to take her daily pill altogether, so the count might be off. She seemed nervous, but not overly defensive. Detective Palmer wasn't satisfied with that answer. Something felt off to her experienced investigator's instincts. She asked Rachel to provide any other medication she had in the house, and Rachel cooperated fully, leading her to the bathroom and opening all the cabinets. They found typical over-the-counter medications, some vitamins, and Kevin's blood pressure medication. But then, in a drawer in Rachel's kitchen, they found something that made everything click into place. There was a small plastic container, the kind you'd use to portion out vitamins or medication for the week, with compartments labeled with the days of the week. Inside, several of the compartments were pills that had been crushed into powder. The container was in a drawer near the blender, along with protein powder, vitamin supplements, and other ingredients Rachel apparently used for making smoothies and health drinks. Rachel claimed the crushed pills were for her own use, that she found them easier to swallow when they were crushed and mixed into yogurt or applesauce. But Detective Palmer asked her a question that Rachel couldn't answer satisfactorily in a way that made sense. If the crushed pills were for her own use, why were they in the kitchen drawer and not in the bathroom with her other medications? And why would she need to pre-crush and portion them for the entire week when she only took them as needed for anxiety, not on a daily schedule? The answers Rachel gave were vague and contradictory, and Detective Palmer's suspicions grew stronger. Detective Palmer was experienced in talking to children who'd been abused or harmed, and she knew how to ask questions in a way that didn't lead or traumatize. She requested another interview with Daniel, this time with more specific questions about his time at Rachel's house. She asked me if I wanted to be present for the interview, and I said yes, even though part of me wanted to run away from the truth I knew was coming. We sat in a comfortable interview room designed for children, with soft chairs and toys and warm lighting. Detective Palmer was gentle with Daniel, starting with easy questions about school and his favorite activities. Then she asked him about his favorite things to do at Aunt Rachel's house. He told her he liked playing video games with Uncle Kevin and building with Legos in the playroom. Then he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. He said that Aunt Rachel always made him special smoothies because she said they were healthy and would help his stomach feel better. My blood ran cold when he said that. I remembered Rachel making smoothies for Daniel. Remembered her telling me she'd read that probiotics and certain fruits could help with digestive issues. At the time, I'd been grateful that she was trying to help. Now those memories took on a sinister meaning. Detective Palmer kept her voice calm and asked Daniel what was in the smoothies. He said they were usually berry-flavored with yogurt and honey, and they tasted really good, kind of sweet with a little bitter aftertaste that the honey covered up. She asked how often he had these smoothies, and he said almost every time he went to Aunt Rachel's house, which was usually 2 or 3 times a week. She asked if anyone else drank the smoothies, and he said no, just him, because Aunt Rachel said she made them special just for him because he had a sensitive tummy and needed extra nutrients. She'd tell him the smoothies were like medicine that would make him feel better, and he should drink the whole thing even if he got full. Detective Palmer asked if the smoothies ever made him feel sick, and Daniel hesitated before answering. He said sometimes his stomach would hurt a few hours after drinking them, but Aunt Rachel said that meant they were working, and his body was getting rid of bad stuff. She told him it was normal to feel worse before feeling better. He said he trusted her because she was his aunt, and she loved him, so he kept drinking the smoothies even when they made him feel bad. The investigation revealed that Rachel had been systematically giving Daniel small doses of her anxiety medication mixed into smoothies for more than 2 years. She'd started when he was 6, around the same time his symptoms began. The doses were carefully calculated to be small enough not to cause immediate severe harm or obvious overdose symptoms, but consistent enough to cause the episodic symptoms that had plagued him. The episodes happened when the medication built up in his system or when she gave him a slightly larger dose than usual. Detective Palmer brought in a forensic toxicologist who examined Daniel's blood work and the timeline of his symptoms. The expert testified that the pattern was consistent with intermittent poisoning over an extended period. The levels found in Daniel's system indicated recent exposure, and the half-life of the drug suggested he'd been given a dose within a few days of the blood test. The toxicologist said that chronic exposure to benzodiazepines in children could cause all the symptoms Daniel experienced, plus potential long-term effects on brain development and emotional regulation. But why? That was the question that haunted me day and night. Why would my sister poison my child? What could possibly motivate someone to systematically harm an innocent child they claimed to love? Detective Palmer said that in cases like this, there were often psychological components. Sometimes it was attention-seeking behavior, sometimes it was a desire for control, and sometimes it stemmed from deeper mental health issues that manifested in harmful ways. The truth came out during Rachel's formal interview after they'd gathered all the evidence and confronted her with the facts. At first, she denied everything vehemently, saying it was all a terrible misunderstanding and she would never hurt Daniel. She cried and said she loved him like her own son. But when faced with the overwhelming evidence, the pills in her kitchen, Daniel's detailed testimony about the smoothies, the toxicology report showing lorazepam in his system, and the pattern of his symptoms corresponding perfectly with visits to her house, she finally broke down. Rachel admitted that she'd been giving Daniel her medication, but she insisted at first that she thought she was helping him. She said that Daniel seemed so anxious and stressed, and she knew that her medication helped her with anxiety, so she thought small amounts might help him too. She said she'd researched it online and found information about benzodiazepines being used for childhood anxiety, and she convinced herself that she was just treating a condition that his doctors had missed. She said she didn't think it would hurt him because the doses were so small. But Detective Palmer pressed her on inconsistencies in her story. If Rachel thought she was helping, why did she hide it from me and Tom? Why didn't she suggest we talk to Daniel's doctor about anxiety medication instead of secretly medicating him herself? Why did she continue for 2 years as Daniel got progressively sicker and his symptoms worsened? Rachel didn't have good answers to those questions. She kept insisting that she thought she was helping, that she loved Daniel like her own child, and that she never meant to hurt him seriously. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a tough woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in child abuse cases, saw things very differently. After reviewing all the evidence and consulting with medical experts and forensic psychologists, they determined that Rachel's actions constituted felony child abuse and child endangerment. The fact that she'd done it repeatedly over an extended period of 2 years, deliberately hidden it from Daniel's parents and doctors, and continued even as Daniel's health deteriorated showed criminal intent, not misguided help. I was faced with an impossible decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The prosecutor's office wanted to press charges and take the case to trial, but they needed my full cooperation as Daniel's mother. They asked me point blank if I wanted them to pursue the case to the fullest extent of the law, which could mean years in prison for Rachel. They explained that without my testimony and cooperation, their case would be much weaker, and Rachel might get a plea deal for a lesser charge with minimal consequences. On one side was my son, who'd suffered physically and emotionally for 2 years because of what Rachel did. He'd endured countless doctor appointments, invasive tests, pain, fear, and confusion. His childhood had been stolen from him. His trust in adults had been shattered. He deserved justice, and the person who hurt him deserved to face consequences. As his mother, my first duty was to protect him and ensure this never happened again. On the other side was my sister, the person I'd been closest to my entire life. We'd shared a bedroom for 18 years. She'd been my maid of honor. Her children were my nieces. My parents would be devastated. Our family would be destroyed. Rachel was claiming she never meant to seriously hurt Daniel, that she'd been struggling with mental health issues and made terrible choices. Part of me wondered if prison was really the answer, or if intensive psychiatric treatment would be more appropriate. Tom had absolutely no doubts about what I should do. He wanted Rachel prosecuted to the maximum extent possible under the law. He said that what she did was inexcusable, regardless of her intentions or mental state, and that she needed to face serious consequences for poisoning our child. He pointed out that she'd had hundreds of opportunities to stop, to confess, to get help, and she'd chosen to continue harming Daniel instead. He said that intent didn't matter when the result was 2 years of suffering for an innocent child. My parents, when they found out about the accusations against Rachel, had a completely different reaction that drove a wedge between us that would never heal. They couldn't believe or refused to believe that their daughter would do something like this intentionally. They kept insisting it must have been an accident or a misunderstanding or a frame job. My mother said that Rachel had always been such a caring person, and there was no way she deliberately hurt Daniel. They suggested that maybe Daniel was lying or confused, which made me furious. Rachel's husband Kevin filed for divorce within 2 weeks of her arrest. He told anyone who would listen that he'd had absolutely no idea what Rachel was doing, and that he was horrified and sickened by her actions. He said he felt betrayed and disgusted that his wife had been poisoning a child in their home while he was at work, completely unaware. He got emergency custody of their twins, Emma and Lily, and filed a restraining order to keep Rachel away from them until the case was resolved. Kevin said he couldn't trust her around his own children after what she'd done to Daniel. He worried that if she could harm her nephew, what might she do to her own daughters if they upset her or if her mental health deteriorated further? He moved out of their house with the twins within days and filed for full custody. He said he'd never let Rachel be alone with the girls again, and he wanted a divorce as quickly as California law would allow. I agonized over the decision for days that felt like years. I barely slept, lying awake night after night, turning it over in my mind. I talked to therapists who specialized in family trauma. I talked to lawyers who explained the legal implications. I talked to friends who had opinions ranging from family loyalty above all else to protecting children at any cost. Everyone had strong feelings, and no one could make this decision for me. Some people said family is family and blood is thicker than water, and I should show mercy and compassion. They argued that Rachel clearly had mental health issues and needed treatment, not punishment. They said that prison would destroy her and wouldn't undo the harm to Daniel. They suggested that I could set boundaries and keep Daniel safe without involving the criminal justice system. They said I'd regret destroying my sister's life and that I'd never get my family back if I testified against her. Others said that protecting children has to come first, even and especially when it means turning in your own family member. They pointed out that child abusers often use family loyalty and obligation to escape consequences. They said that Rachel had made her choices every single day for 2 years, and she deserved to face the full weight of those choices. They argued that letting her off easy would send a message that harming children is acceptable if you have a good excuse. I visited Rachel in jail before her bail hearing, needing to look her in the eye and hear directly from her what had really happened. She was being held without bail initially because the judge considered her a potential flight risk and danger to children. She was a mess when I saw her, wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair unwashed, her face puffy from crying. She grabbed my hands through the glass partition and begged me to forgive her and to tell the prosecutor I didn't want to press charges. She told me a story that made everything so much worse instead of better. She said that she'd been struggling with severe postpartum depression and anxiety after having the twins, much worse than she'd ever admitted to anyone. She said she'd felt inadequate as a mother, like she was failing at everything. She said seeing how happy and healthy and well-adjusted Daniel was made her feel like a complete failure in comparison. Some dark part of her, she admitted, wanted him to be less perfect so that I'd understand how hard motherhood could be and stop making it look so easy. She said she never planned to hurt him seriously or permanently. She just wanted him to be a little bit sick, to have some problems, so that I'd struggle too, and she wouldn't feel so alone in her inadequacy. She said she'd started with tiny doses, telling herself it was harmless, and then she couldn't stop. It became compulsive. Every time she made him a smoothie, she felt powerful and in control of something when everything else in her life felt chaotic. She said she knew it was wrong, but she was trapped in the behavior and didn't know how to stop without confessing what she'd done. Her confession made everything infinitely worse somehow. It wasn't about helping Daniel at all, despite what she'd initially claimed. It wasn't even about attention or sympathy for herself. It was about jealousy, resentment, and her own untreated mental health issues. She'd used my child, my innocent, trusting child, to make herself feel better about her own perceived failures as a mother. She'd watched him suffer, watched me cry and worry myself sick, watched our family go through hell, and she'd kept doing it because it gave her some twisted sense of control and satisfaction. I made my decision sitting in that jail visiting room, looking at my sister through the scratched plexiglass barrier. I told her I couldn't forgive her, not now and maybe not ever. I told her that she'd had countless chances to stop, to get help, to confess, and she'd chosen to keep harming my child instead. I told her that whatever happened to her next was a consequence of her own choices, and I wouldn't protect her from those consequences. I walked out of that jail and called the prosecutor to tell her I would fully cooperate with the prosecution. I told the prosecutor I wanted them to pursue all charges to the fullest extent. I provided detailed testimony at the grand jury hearing, walking them through every doctor's appointment, every episode, every piece of evidence that showed what Daniel had been through. I brought medical records, my notebooks full of observations, photos of Daniel during his worst episodes, looking pale and sick, and videos I'd taken of him playing happily that showed what he was like when he wasn't being poisoned. I testified at Rachel's trial when it came to that, taking the stand and answering questions for hours about Daniel's symptoms, our relationship with Rachel, how much we'd trusted her, and how she'd betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. I had to look at Rachel across the courtroom while I testified, and she cried through most of it. Part of me felt guilty for putting her there, but a bigger part of me thought about Daniel and what he'd endured, and I knew I was doing the right thing. Rachel's defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity due to mental illness, presenting evidence of her postpartum depression and anxiety disorders. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified that Rachel had been suffering from a severe, untreated mental health crisis that impaired her judgment. They argued that she needed treatment, not prison, and that incarcerating her would serve no rehabilitative purpose. They painted her as a victim of her own illness who needed compassion and help. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming, and the jury saw through the defense strategy. Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor, methodically laid out the evidence of deliberate, calculated, sustained abuse. She showed that Rachel had researched the medication's effects online, had carefully measured doses, had developed a system for concealing what she was doing, and had continued for 2 years despite numerous opportunities to stop. This wasn't impulsive behavior driven by mental illness. This was planned, intentional, ongoing abuse of a child. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Rachel was convicted of felony child abuse, child endangerment, and administering harmful substances to a minor. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later to allow time for pre-sentencing reports and evaluations. Rachel remained in custody without bail after the conviction, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. Justice was being served, but my family was destroyed. At the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to read a victim impact statement on Daniel's behalf. I'd spent weeks writing it, trying to capture the full scope of what Rachel's actions had cost us. I described Daniel's suffering in detail, the physical pain and the emotional trauma. I talked about how his personality had changed, how he'd lost his childhood innocence, and his ability to trust adults. I explained that he still couldn't drink smoothies without having a panic attack, that he had nightmares about being poisoned, and that he was in therapy multiple times a week trying to heal from what his aunt had done to him. I also talked about the broader impact on our family. I described how Tom and I had nearly divorced from the stress. I talked about how my relationship with my parents had been destroyed because they chose to support Rachel over Daniel. I explained how Emma and Lily had lost their mother, and how Daniel had lost his cousins and his extended family. I said that Rachel's choices had created ripples of damage that spread far beyond just her and Daniel, affecting everyone in our family in devastating ways. The judge listened to everything carefully, reviewed all the evidence and psychiatric evaluations, and then delivered the sentence. She sentenced Rachel to 6 years in prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. She also ordered Rachel to have absolutely no contact with Daniel, directly or indirectly, for the rest of his childhood, and to attend intensive psychiatric treatment, both in prison and after release. She could petition for contact after Daniel turned 18, but only if Daniel consented as an adult. The judge was clear that Rachel's mental health issues didn't excuse or mitigate what she'd done to an innocent child. The conviction made the local news because child poisoning cases are relatively rare and shocking. Our small community where everyone knew everyone suddenly knew our family's darkest, most painful secret. The Sacramento Bee ran a story with the headline, "Local Woman Sentenced for Poisoning Nephew," and it included enough details that anyone who knew us would recognize our family. People at the grocery store would whisper and point when they saw me. The pharmacy where I picked up Daniel's medications, the bank where we had our accounts, everywhere we went, people knew who we were and what had happened. Some people were incredibly supportive and told me I'd done the right thing by protecting my child and seeking justice. They said I was brave for testifying against my own sister and that Rachel deserved everything she got. They brought meals to our house, sent cards of encouragement, and offered to help with anything we needed. Their support meant everything during those dark months. But others gave me dirty looks and whispered that I should have handled it privately within the family instead of airing our dirty laundry in public and sending my sister to prison. They said family should protect family, and I'd betrayed that sacred trust. Some people said I was vindictive and unforgiving, that Rachel clearly needed help, not punishment, and that I'd ruined her life over what might have been a mental health crisis. Their judgment stung, even though I knew I'd made the right choice. Daniel's school situation became complicated. Some of his friends' parents didn't want their kids around Daniel anymore, as if what happened to him was somehow contagious, or as if our family was cursed or dangerous. They made excuses for why their kids couldn't come to our house for playdates anymore. Some parents pulled their kids out of activities Daniel was in. The principal had to intervene when some parents demanded Daniel be removed from their children's classes, which was absurd and cruel but showed how much stigma surrounded our situation. Other parents were wonderful and understanding. They made extra efforts to include Daniel, to make sure he knew he was wanted and valued. They educated their children about what Daniel had been through in age-appropriate ways, teaching them empathy and kindness. Those families became our support system when so much of our previous community fell away. We learned who our real friends were during that time, and it wasn't always the people we expected. My parents took Rachel's side completely and cut off contact with me, Tom, and Daniel. My mother called me repeatedly in the weeks after Rachel's conviction, leaving increasingly angry voicemails. She said that I'd destroyed the family by insisting on pressing charges. She said that Rachel needed help and support, not prison, and that I should have shown compassion and forgiveness. She said I was cruel and vindictive and that I'd never understand until I'd walked in Rachel's shoes, dealing with severe mental illness. My father barely spoke to me at all, but he made his position clear through my mother. They paid for Rachel's expensive defense attorney, spending over $100,000 trying to keep her out of prison. They attended every court hearing and sat on Rachel's side of the courtroom, never once sitting with me or acknowledging Daniel's suffering. They visited Rachel in prison every single week without fail, and they sent her money for commissary and made sure she had everything she needed. They made it clear that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings or even in their home. When I tried to call my mother on her birthday, she didn't answer. When I sent my father a card on Father's Day, it was returned unopened. They'd chosen their side, and it wasn't mine or Daniel's. The family dinners, the holiday celebrations, the birthday parties, all of it stopped. Our family of origin was simply gone, erased, as if Tom, Daniel, and I had never existed. Tom's parents, who lived in Florida, were supportive from a distance, but they were elderly and couldn't provide much practical help. They sent cards and called regularly to check on us and Daniel. They told us repeatedly that we'd done the right thing and that they were proud of us for protecting Daniel. But they were too far away to help with daily struggles, and we felt very alone dealing with the aftermath of Rachel's crimes and the destruction of my family. Some days I questioned whether I should have handled it differently, whether there was some other path I could have taken that wouldn't have resulted in losing my entire family of origin. Maybe I could have insisted Rachel get intensive inpatient psychiatric treatment without involving the criminal justice system. Maybe I could have set strict supervised visitation rules and given her a chance to prove she could be safe. Maybe there was a way to protect Daniel without destroying everything else. But then I'd remember Daniel's face during those episodes, pale and sweating and begging me to make the pain stop. I'd remember the 2 years of doctor appointments and tests and watching my child suffer while the person responsible pretended to care. I'd remember that Rachel had hundreds of chances to stop, to confess, to get help, and she'd chosen to keep hurting him instead. And I'd know that I'd made the only choice a mother could make when her child's safety was at stake. Daniel started intensive trauma therapy to work through what happened to him. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, specialized in childhood trauma and had experience with cases of abuse by family members. She said that Daniel was dealing with layers of trauma, not just from the physical effects of being poisoned, but from the betrayal by someone he loved and trusted. She said abuse cases were particularly damaging because they violated the child's sense of safety within their own family. The therapist said Daniel had been carrying the weight of keeping Rachel's secret, even though he hadn't fully understood what was happening to him. He'd known on some level that the smoothies made him feel sick, but he'd trusted his aunt completely and hadn't known how to tell us, or that he even should tell us. Rachel had told him the smoothies were helping him get better, that feeling sick meant they were working, and he'd believed her because she was an adult he loved. The therapist said it would take years for him to learn to trust adults again and to feel truly safe. The physical effects of the medication exposure faded over time, and that was perhaps the only bright spot in everything. Once Rachel was arrested and Daniel stopped going to her house and drinking the smoothies, the stomach episodes stopped completely within 2 weeks. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, the symptoms that had plagued him for 2 years just vanished. His liver enzymes returned to normal within a month. His energy came back. His color improved. Physically, he recovered fully and quickly, which Dr. Morrison said was incredibly fortunate. The toxicologist had warned us that chronic benzodiazepine exposure in children could potentially cause lasting neurological effects or developmental delays, but Daniel showed no signs of permanent physical damage. His body healed itself once the poisoning stopped. But emotionally and psychologically, the scars were much deeper and would take far longer to heal. Daniel developed severe anxiety around food, and especially drinks, that he couldn't see being prepared from start to finish. He had nightmares about being poisoned, waking up screaming and crying about bad smoothies and being unable to breathe. He became hypervigilant about his food and everything he consumed, asking me to taste everything before he'd eat or drink it. He refused to eat or drink anything that anyone else prepared, even at school, bringing his own lunch and water bottle every single day without exception. He refused to drink smoothies of any kind, even ones I made right in front of him with ingredients he'd chosen himself. The sight of a blender would sometimes trigger panic attacks where he'd hyperventilate and cry. We had to put our blender away in a cabinet he couldn't see because just looking at it upset him. Dr. Chen said these were all normal trauma responses and that with time and therapy, he'd gradually learn to feel safe around food again. Rachel's twins, Emma and Lily, became innocent casualties of the situation too, and that broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Kevin moved them to a different school district in a different town to get away from the publicity and gossip surrounding Rachel's conviction. The local news coverage meant everyone knew their mother had poisoned her nephew, and kids at school were cruel about it. They needed a fresh start somewhere people didn't know their family history. Daniel, who'd been close to his cousins and had played with them weekly for their entire lives, never saw Emma and Lily again after Rachel's arrest. Kevin made it clear that he didn't want any contact between our families while the criminal case was ongoing, and after Rachel was convicted, he maintained that boundary permanently. He said it was too confusing and painful for the girls to maintain contact with Daniel when their mother was in prison for hurting him. They'd lost their mother, and he didn't want them to lose their childhood to the trauma of what she'd done. The twins didn't understand why their mother was suddenly gone or why their daddy said they couldn't have contact with our family anymore. They were only 5 years old when Rachel was arrested, far too young to understand concepts like child abuse and criminal prosecution. Kevin told them their mother was sick and had to go away for a long time to get better, which was true in its own way, but didn't explain why everything in their lives had been turned upside down. Those little girls lost everything almost overnight. They lost their mother, their father's trust and peace of mind, their home when Kevin moved them to a new town, their school and friends, and their extended family, including Daniel, who'd been like a big brother to them. They became victims of Rachel's choices just as surely as Daniel did, and there was nothing I could do to help them or maintain our relationship. That loss grieved me deeply. My relationship with Tom was severely strained during the first year after Rachel's arrest and conviction. He was angry at me for not seeing what was happening sooner, for trusting Rachel so completely with Daniel. He'd say things like, "She's your sister. How did you not know something was wrong? And you sent him over there knowing he always got sick afterwards." His words cut deep because they echoed my own guilt and self-recrimination. I'd lie awake at night, replaying every interaction with Rachel over those 2 years, looking for signs I'd missed, clues I should have caught. Had she seemed too eager to have Daniel visit? Had there been something off in her behavior that I'd dismissed? Had Daniel tried to tell me something was wrong in ways I hadn't recognized? The guilt was absolutely crushing and all-consuming. I was Daniel's mother, his primary protector, and I was supposed to keep him safe. Instead, I'd unknowingly sent him into the arms of someone who was systematically poisoning him for 2 years. Tom threw himself into work, staying late at the office, to avoid coming home to the mess and tension our lives had become. He picked up extra projects and volunteered for travel assignments he'd normally decline. I spent my time managing Daniel's multiple weekly therapy appointments and dealing with the endless legal aftermath of Rachel's case. Tom and I barely spoke to each other beyond logistics like who's picking up Daniel from school and did you pay the electric bill. The marriage counselor we finally started seeing after months of barely holding it together said that trauma like this either brings couples together or tears them apart irrevocably, and we were heading toward the latter. She said we were both drowning in our own pain and guilt and fear, and instead of reaching for each other for support, we were lashing out and pushing each other away. For a while, it looked like our marriage might not survive what Rachel had done to our family. One night, About 8 months after Rachel was sentenced, Tom and I had a massive fight that erupted over something trivial and escalated into everything we'd been holding back for months. He accused me of caring more about protecting Rachel and preserving my relationship with my parents than I had about protecting Daniel. I accused him of not understanding how impossible the situation had been, of judging me for not seeing something that was deliberately hidden from me. We said terrible, cruel things to each other, things designed to hurt because we were both hurting so much and didn't know how else to express it. I told him I wished I'd never introduced him to my family, that if we'd stayed isolated from them, maybe none of this would have happened. He said he wished he'd trusted his instincts about Rachel because he'd always thought something was off about her, always felt she was too interested in Daniel. He said I'd dismissed his concerns and made him feel like he was being paranoid and unfair, and maybe if I'd listened to him, we could have protected Daniel sooner. We were both crying and yelling, years of pain and fear and guilt pouring out in one devastating conversation. That fight was a turning point, a moment where we either had to recommit to each other or accept that our marriage was over. We both realized in the aftermath of that explosion that we were in real danger of losing each other on top of everything else we'd already lost. We couldn't let Rachel take our marriage too. We committed to intensive couples therapy twice a week and to actually communicating honestly instead of avoiding each other and letting resentment build up. It was incredibly hard work, peeling back all the layers of pain and resentment and fear and guilt that had accumulated. But slowly, painfully, week by week and session by session, we started to find our way back to each other. We learned to talk about the trauma without blame, to support each other through the guilt and grief, to work together instead of against each other. We remembered why we'd fallen in love and built a life together. We focused on being a team for Daniel's sake and our own. After about 6 months of intensive therapy, Tom and I were in a much better place, stronger in some ways than we'd been before, bonded by surviving something that would have destroyed many marriages. Daniel's recovery was not linear or simple, but filled with progress and setbacks. He'd have good weeks where he seemed almost like his old self, laughing and engaged with school and activities. Then something would trigger him unexpectedly. A TV show featuring a family gathering, seeing a woman at the store who looked like Rachel, or someone at school innocently asking about his cousins, and he'd regress into fear and withdrawal. His therapist taught him coping mechanisms like breathing exercises, grounding techniques, and ways to talk about his feelings instead of bottling them up. Dr. Chen said that this kind of profound betrayal trauma from a trusted family member would affect Daniel for years and possibly for life. She said that his ability to trust people, especially authority figures and family members, had been fundamentally damaged. She said many adult survivors of childhood abuse by family members struggled with relationships, trust, and feeling safe in the world. But she also said that with consistent therapy, family support, and his own resilience, Daniel could heal and go on to live a full, healthy life. The trauma would always be part of his story, but it didn't have to define him forever. About 18 months after Rachel's conviction, I received a letter from her in prison, forwarded through the prosecutor's office to avoid direct contact. She'd been going to therapy and participating in mental health treatment programs offered by the prison. She said she wanted to apologize and take full responsibility for what she'd done. The letter was pages long, filled with remorse and self-reflection and explanations of the work she was doing to understand why she'd harmed Daniel. She wrote about how sorry she was, how she couldn't believe what she'd done to a child she'd claimed to love. She said therapy had helped her understand the depths of her postpartum depression and how her untreated mental illness had twisted her thinking into something dark and harmful. She said she hoped someday, maybe years from now, I could find it in my heart to forgive her. She said she understood if I never wanted to see her again, but she needed me to know that she was working on herself and trying to become someone worthy of eventual redemption, even though she knew she might never achieve it. I read that letter multiple times, and each time I felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Anger that she thought a letter could somehow make up for 2 years of poisoning my child. Sadness for the sister I'd lost and the family that had been destroyed. Emptiness where love and trust used to be. I didn't respond to the letter because I couldn't. I had nothing to say to her, no forgiveness to offer, no interest in her journey of self-discovery and rehabilitation. I put the letter in a drawer and tried to move on with my life. Part of me wanted to write back and tell her exactly how much damage she'd caused, how she hadn't just hurt Daniel but had destroyed an entire family and ruined multiple lives. I wanted to tell her about Daniel's nightmares, about the panic attacks, about how he couldn't drink a smoothie or trust adults or feel safe. I wanted to describe how Tom and I had almost divorced, how my parents had disowned me, how Emma and Lily had lost their mother and their cousins, but another part of me just felt exhausted and empty. The anger had burned itself out over the months, leaving behind a kind of numb sadness. She was my sister. I'd loved her deeply, and now she was gone from my life as surely and completely as if she died. My mother called me on what would have been our annual family reunion about 2 years after Rachel went to prison. It was held every August at my parents' lake house, a tradition going back decades. She was crying on the phone, saying that the family wasn't whole without all of us together, that holidays and celebrations felt empty and wrong. She begged me to drop the restraining order that prevented Rachel from having any contact with Daniel so Rachel could attend the reunion once she got out on parole in a few more years. She said families are supposed to forgive each other and stay together through everything. I told her, absolutely not. The restraining order was for Daniel's protection and peace of mind, and I wouldn't compromise on that for anyone or anything. I explained that Daniel was in therapy working through profound trauma, and exposing him to his abuser would be cruel and re-traumatizing. I said that if she couldn't understand that protecting Daniel had to come first, then we had nothing more to discuss. She called me cruel and unforgiving, said I was punishing the whole family for Rachel's mistakes, and that I'd regret my hardness someday. We haven't spoken since that phone call, and I don't expect we ever will again. Daniel asked me about Rachel sometimes as he got older and could better understand what had happened to him. He wanted to know why she did it, whether she ever really loved him, and most heartbreakingly, if it was somehow his fault. Those questions broke my heart into a million pieces every single time he asked them. His therapist, Dr. Chen, and I worked together carefully to give him age-appropriate answers that wouldn't leave him carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. We told him repeatedly that Rachel had been very sick in her mind, with an illness she didn't get help for, that none of it was his fault in any way, and that what she did was completely wrong no matter what she was going through or what reasons she gave. The hardest part was watching Daniel lose his innocence and his natural trust in the goodness of people. He used to trust everyone automatically and see the best in people, believing adults would keep him safe. Now he was wary and cautious, analyzing people's intentions and motivations before he'd let them get close to him. His teachers reported that he'd become protective of other kids at school, especially younger children or kids who seemed vulnerable. He'd intervene if he saw bullying and would befriend kids who were alone or struggling. His therapist said this was his way of trying to regain a sense of control and prevent other children from being hurt the way he was hurt. He was turning his trauma into a mission to protect others, which could be healthy if channeled properly, but could also be a burden for a child to carry. We worked with him on understanding that he couldn't fix or save everyone, that it wasn't his job to protect every child, and that he needed to focus on his own healing too. Tom and I made the difficult decision to move to a different city when Daniel was 10 years old, about 2 years after Rachel's conviction. The weight of everyone knowing our story, the whispers in stores, the awkward conversations at school functions, the looks of pity or judgment, all of it was too much. Every place we went in Sacramento held memories, and too many people knew the worst details of our private trauma. We wanted to give Daniel a fresh start where he could just be a kid without the constant shadow of what had happened hanging over him. Tom had a job opportunity in Portland, Oregon that he'd been considering for a while. The timing felt right. We sold our house in Sacramento, the home where Daniel had grown up, and moved north to start over. It was bittersweet leaving behind the few friends who'd stood by us, but we needed distance from the pain and publicity. We needed to rebuild our lives in a place where people didn't immediately recognize our family as the one from that terrible poisoning case in the news. The move helped more than I dared to hope. Daniel made new friends at his new school who didn't know anything about what had happened to him. He could just be Daniel, a regular kid who liked soccer and video games and reading fantasy novels. He joined a soccer team and started to smile more genuinely and frequently. His nightmares became less frequent, dropping from nearly every night to once or twice a week. He still went to therapy weekly with a new therapist in Portland, but he was making steady progress toward healing. Tom and I were in a better place too in our new city. We'd worked through the worst of our pain and anger in couples therapy and had recommitted to our marriage and our family. We went on date nights every week, just the two of us reconnecting as partners and not just parents managing a crisis. We learned to communicate better, to support each other through the ongoing challenges of raising a traumatized child, and to find joy in small moments. We were stronger together than we'd been in years, but the scars remained visible if you knew where to look. Daniel was now 13. And while he'd made tremendous progress, he still dealt with significant trust issues and anxiety that might never fully go away. He was terrified to eat or drink anything that someone else prepared unless he watched them make it from start to finish. At restaurants, he'd only order things he could see being cooked, and even then he'd sometimes have panic attacks worrying the food might be contaminated or drugged. School lunch was impossible for him. He brought his own lunch every single day, packed by me or by him, while I watched in containers he could seal himself. If he forgot his lunch, he'd rather go hungry all day than eat cafeteria food. His friends thought it was weird, but eventually accepted it as just a Daniel quirk. The school counselor worked with us to make sure he could always bring his own food without it becoming a big deal with other students. He had panic attacks if he felt trapped or controlled by adults he didn't know well. A substitute teacher who used an authoritarian style sent him into a meltdown that required the school counselor and me to come calm him down. His regular teachers knew his history and made accommodations, giving him control over small things and never forcing him to do activities that triggered his trauma responses. The school was incredibly supportive, which made a huge difference in his ability to function day to day. The therapist said these were all normal responses to what he'd experienced, and that with time and continued treatment, he'd learn to manage them better and maybe even overcome some of them. But she was also honest that profound betrayal trauma like Daniel's often left permanent marks. Many adult survivors still struggled with trust and food-related anxiety decades later. The goal wasn't to erase what happened, but to help Daniel build coping skills and resilience so the trauma didn't control his entire life. Rachel was released on parole after serving 4 years of her 6-year sentence, getting out early for good behavior and completion of mental health treatment programs. She moved in with our parents, who'd never stopped supporting her and visiting her weekly throughout her incarceration. She was required to attend ongoing therapy, check in regularly with her parole officer, maintain employment, and of course, have absolutely no contact with Daniel, per the restraining order that would remain in effect until he turned 18. I heard through mutual acquaintances and the occasional internet search that she'd gotten a job at a grocery store, stocking shelves on the night shift. She kept a low profile, apparently working and going to therapy and trying to rebuild some kind of life. Part of me hoped she'd found some measure of peace and was genuinely working on her mental health. But mostly I tried not to think about her at all. She was part of a past I'd worked hard to move beyond. Kevin had remarried about 3 years after his divorce from Rachel was finalized. His new wife, Amanda, was a teacher who'd never been married before and had no children of her own. She adopted Emma and Lily after marrying Kevin, giving them stability and a mother figure who was present and safe. Kevin sent me a brief email letting me know about the adoption so I wouldn't hear it through gossip channels. He said the girls were doing well, were in therapy to work through the trauma of what their biological mother had done, and that they rarely asked about Rachel anymore. He said he thought it was best if our families didn't have contact, that it was too complicated and confusing for Emma and Lily to maintain relationships with Daniel and our family given everything that had happened. I agreed completely, though it made me sad. Those little girls deserved a chance at a normal, happy childhood without the shadow of what Rachel had done hanging over them. They deserved to move forward without constant reminders of how their mother had poisoned their cousin. But I mourned the relationship they could have had with Daniel, the family connection that was lost forever. Sometimes, late at night, I still wondered what would have happened if I'd made different choices at critical moments. What if I'd handled everything privately, gotten Rachel into intensive inpatient psychiatric treatment without involving the police? Would my family still be intact? Would my parents still speak to me? Would Emma and Lily still have their mother in their lives, supervised and treated but present? Would Rachel have gotten the help she needed without the trauma of prison? These questions haunted me on hard days when the weight of all we'd lost felt crushing. I had to actively remind myself, sometimes multiple times a day, that protecting Daniel had to come first above everything else. Rachel had poisoned my child for 2 years. She'd watched him suffer and had continued harming him for her own twisted psychological reasons. She'd had hundreds of opportunities to stop, to confess, to get help, and she'd chosen to keep hurting him instead. The consequences she faced were direct results of choices she'd made repeatedly over a very long time. The relationship with my parents was perhaps the most painful loss of everything that had been destroyed. I'd always been close to them growing up, talking to my mother almost daily and visiting them several times a month. Suddenly, they'd chosen Rachel's side completely and totally. They'd decided that I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to destroy the family by involving law enforcement. They couldn't see, or absolutely refused to see, that Rachel's actions had been the destructive force, not my response to them. The injustice of that burned in my chest even years later. I'd lost my sister, my parents, my extended family, my childhood home, my community, and my sense of safety all at once. The cost of protecting Daniel had been almost everything else in my life. Some days that felt overwhelmingly unfair. Why did I have to lose so much for doing the right thing? Why did choosing to protect my child from his abuser mean losing my entire family of origin? But then I'd look at Daniel, alive and slowly healing, and I'd know I'd make the same choices again without hesitation. Daniel started high school in Portland, and he seemed to be genuinely thriving in ways that filled me with cautious hope. He'd grown into a thoughtful, empathetic teenager who volunteered at a local children's hospital on weekends. He said he wanted to help kids who were scared or sick because he remembered vividly how that felt, and he wanted to make it easier for them. His therapist said that transforming his trauma into purpose and service was a very healthy way of processing what he'd been through and finding meaning in his suffering. He decided he wanted to study psychology or social work in college, with the goal of eventually working with families dealing with trauma and abuse. He said that if his experience could lead him to help even one child or family in the future, then something good would have come from what happened to him. His resilience and his determination to turn his pain into something meaningful amazed me every single day. This kid who'd been systematically poisoned and betrayed had grown into a young man committed to helping others heal from similar traumas. Tom and I celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant, just the two of us. We talked about everything we'd survived together and how it had fundamentally changed us as individuals and as a couple. We weren't the same people we'd been before Rachel's actions came to light. We were more cautious, more aware of how quickly life could fall apart, more vigilant about protecting what mattered most. But we were also more grateful for what we had, more committed to each other, and stronger for having fought so hard for our marriage and our family. I still carried guilt, heavy and persistent. Guilt that I hadn't protected Daniel sooner, that I'd trusted Rachel with him for so long without seeing what was happening, that I'd missed signs that might have been there. My therapist, whom I still saw monthly for my own healing, reminded me repeatedly that Rachel had been deliberately deceptive and calculating. She'd carefully hidden what she was doing and had manipulated all of us. I'd had no reason to suspect my own sister would harm my child, and Rachel had exploited that trust ruthlessly. Intellectually, I understood that I couldn't have known what I had no way of knowing. Emotionally, the guilt persisted like a low-grade ache that never completely went away. I was Daniel's mother. Protecting him was my most important job, and someone had hurt him right under my nose for 2 years. That failure, even though it wasn't really a failure, haunted me. I had to work constantly to forgive myself for not being omniscient, for not seeing through Rachel's deception. Daniel was now 16 and applying to colleges, focused on psychology programs with strong clinical training. He wanted to specialize in childhood trauma and family therapy. He said he wanted to help other kids who'd been betrayed by people they trusted, to give them the support and understanding he'd needed during his darkest times. He wrote his college application essays about his experience, about how surviving abuse had shaped his desire to help others and his understanding of resilience and healing. His essays were powerful and honest, and I cried reading them. The legal bills from Rachel's case had been substantial and had taken years to pay off completely. Between lawyer fees for the civil restraining order, court costs, expert witness fees, and Daniel's ongoing therapy expenses, we'd spent over $70,000. We'd had to dip deeply into Daniel's college fund and take out a second mortgage on our house in Sacramento before selling it. But I'd make the same financial choices again without hesitation. You can't put a price on your child's safety and well-being. Money can be earned back. Daniel's childhood and innocence couldn't be. I ran into an old friend from Sacramento at a nursing conference in Seattle. We'd been close before everything happened, but had lost touch during the chaos of the trial and our move. She filled me in on all the family gossip and community news I'd missed over the years. Rachel had apparently violated her parole about 18 months after her release by going to a bar, which was prohibited under her parole terms. She'd been sent back to prison for 8 months to serve out the remainder of her original sentence. My friend told me that my parents had spent most of their retirement savings, over $200,000, on legal fees trying to get Rachel's sentence reduced and then trying to get her parole violation dismissed. The family home where Rachel and I had grown up, a beautiful old Victorian that had been in our family for 3 generations, had been sold to pay for those legal costs. My parents now lived in a small apartment. The ripple effects of Rachel's actions just kept spreading outward year after year, hurting more people, destroying more things, like a stone thrown into a pond, creating ever-widening circles of damage. Daniel graduated from high school with honors and got accepted to several excellent psychology programs. He chose a university in Seattle that had a strong trauma research center and committed faculty in childhood development and family systems. He'd be living in dorms, his first time truly independent, and I was terrified and proud in equal measure. My baby, who'd been so hurt and betrayed, was going out into the world to build his own life and help others. It felt miraculous after everything he'd been through. On the day we dropped him off at college, I hugged him tight and told him how proud I was of him, not just for his academic achievements, but for his incredible strength and resilience. He'd survived something that would have broken many people, and he'd chosen to use that experience to develop empathy and purpose. He hugged me back and said that he couldn't have made it without me and Tom fighting for him and believing him and getting him the help he needed. He said knowing we'd chosen him over everything else had given him the foundation to heal. Now Daniel is 19, thriving in college, and talking about graduate school to become a licensed therapist specializing in childhood trauma. He has a girlfriend who knows his history and is supportive and understanding. He still has hard days where the trauma catches up to him, but they're becoming less frequent. He's built a life for himself that's full of meaning and purpose and connection. Watching him succeed and grow and heal has been the greatest gift after years of pain. Tom and I are in our late 40s now, looking toward the future with hope instead of fear for the first time in over a decade. We've rebuilt our lives in Portland, made new friends, and found a community that supports us. We still see our couples therapist occasionally for tune-ups when life gets stressful. We've learned that marriage requires constant work and communication, especially after trauma. But we're solid, committed, and grateful for each other. I think about Rachel sometimes still, wonder what her life is like now, and whether she's found any peace or redemption. She served out her full sentence after the parole violation and has been out for about a year now. I heard she moved to a different state to start over where nobody knows her history. I hope she's getting the ongoing mental health treatment she needs. I hope she's found some way to live with what she did. But mostly I try not to think about her at all because that part of my life is over. My parents sent me a letter last year, the first contact in over 8 years. They're both in their 70s now and in declining health. They said they wanted to reconcile before they died, that they'd like to meet Daniel and try to rebuild some kind of relationship. They said they understood now that I'd done what I thought was right for my child, even if they still believed I'd been too harsh. They asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive them for choosing Rachel over Daniel all those years ago. I haven't responded to that letter yet. I don't know if I will. Part of me wants to give Daniel the chance to know his grandparents before they're gone. But another part of me remembers how they abandoned him when he needed them most. How they chose his abuser over him. How they made him feel like what happened to him didn't matter. I don't know if I can forgive that or if Daniel would even want a relationship with people who hurt him so deeply by their absence and their choices. It's a question I'm still working through in therapy. What I do know is that I made the right choice when I reported Rachel to CPS and cooperated fully with her prosecution. Protecting Daniel was my first responsibility as his mother, and I fulfilled that responsibility even though the cost was devastating. I lost my sister, my parents, my extended family, my community, and nearly lost my marriage. But Daniel is alive and healing and building a future. That's what matters most. That will always be what matters most. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to report the medical findings to Child Protective Services, because this decision didn't just change Rachel's life. It cost her the husband she loved when Kevin divorced her, turned our parents against me permanently, and left our family so fractured that Daniel has never seen his cousins Emma and Lily again in all these years. The extended family that used to gather for holidays and celebrations simply doesn't exist anymore. My parents sold the family home to pay for Rachel's legal defense, and I know with absolute certainty that my parents won't be inviting me or Daniel to any family events, probably not even to their funerals when that time comes.